The prairie settlement lay hushed in the late afternoon, a thin wind sweeping dry grit along its lone street. Dust slid into the cracks of false front buildings and drifted over the hitching rails where two weary horses shifted their weight. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This was no bustling town, just one saloon, a modest store, a sheriff's office, and a handful of weathered cabins edging miles of pale grassland cut by ridges of rock. Strangers rarely found welcome here, least of all those who bore the features of the native people settlers had driven from their homelands. Out on the flats, Waya Sky Feather pushed forward with deliberate steps. At 23, hardship had carved fine lines around her eyes, making her appear older. Her buckskin-colored dress hung torn at the shoulder and hip streaked with dried blood from a wound only half-healed. Hunger had thinned her frame, but she held herself straight. Each step toward the settlement was a wager. She knew well how such towns looked on a woman of Apache blood, like trouble, like an unwelcome reminder of raids and loss. For years she had avoided these places. Now her strength was nearly spent. Turning back meant dying alone on the plains. She told herself this was not surrender, but a last fierce choice to live. Her heart pounded harder as she neared a familiar homestead on the outskirts. A small corral patched with mismatched boards came into view. She knew this place. Long ago, before soldiers scattered her people, she had played here as a child. Memory rose like a quiet flame of a boy who once shared warm bread with her, who had sat with her by the creek, unafraid of who she was. That memory had stayed like a smooth stone in her pocket, a piece of the past she could still touch. Would he know her now, or had time and bitterness buried those days? Still, her feet kept moving until she reached the gate. Inside the corral, Clay Maddox worked a hammer and bent nail with steady rhythm. Broad-shouldered and 30 years old, he bore the look of a man shaped by long, hard miles. A brother lost in Kansas, a ranch job thrown away after a saloon fight, too many seasons drifting where no one cared to learn his name. 2 years back, he'd come here to quiet the noise of the world, raising a few head of cattle and keeping to himself. When Clay first noticed the figure at his gate, his body tensed. He saw the torn dress, the way she braced against pain, and the unmistakable Apache features that would spark suspicion in town. A stranger on his land meant questions, and questions brought trouble. For an instant he thought of turning away. Then she lifted her face, and recognition struck him. It was Waya Sky Feather, the girl who once shared berries by his family's cook fire, the one he sometimes pictured in silent hours when wondering what became of those driven from their camps. She wasn't a memory now. She stood before him scarred but unbroken. Waya caught the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Fear tightened her stomach. If he sent her off, she had nowhere left to go. She steadied her voice and said, quiet but firm, "Don't you recognize me, Cowboy? I'm the girl who once held your heart." Clay's jaw hardened. The words cut through years of silence. Guilt pricked him how close he'd come to shutting his door on someone who had once meant so much. He wrestled with the thought of what her presence might stir in town, and whether he was ready to shoulder another person's burden. Then he set the board aside, pulled the nail from his teeth, and crossed to the gate. Without a word of welcome, he swung it open and motioned toward the shaded stoop where a bucket of water waited. "Sit," he said, voice level but sure. Waya stepped inside, knees threatening to give. For the first time in weeks, she felt a shift inside fear still there. But she was no longer alone. She lowered herself onto the stoop, careful not to tear the fabric over her ribs. Sunlight flashed on the tin ladle as she reached for water with trembling hands. The first swallow burned her throat, yet she drank until her chest eased. Clay stood a few paces off, hammer still in hand, silent and watchful. The woman from his past was no ghost. She was flesh and blood, and her presence meant trouble with the settlement, yet he could not send her back into the emptiness, not with that dark stain of injury on her dress and exhaustion etched into her face. Inside the cabin smelled of wood smoke and long work. Bare walls, a single table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed, shelves lined with jars of beans and dried corn. Every piece spoke of a man who lived alone and trusted little. He motioned her in. She hesitated, knowing how rare it was for a man here to open his door to her, then stepped across the threshold. Clay set down the plate from his own meal cornbread, a strip of bacon-thick beans, and nodded. Eat. That single word eased her doubt. She took small, measured bites, eyes lowered, as though afraid the food might be taken back, while he stood nearby, silent and steady, the weight of new choices already pressing on them both, while Waya Sky Feather ate. Clay Maddox filled a tin basin with fresh water and set a folded cloth beside it. He paused, sensing how the quiet in the cabin carried questions neither of them had yet dared to ask. His voice came low and steady as he studied the torn place at her side. You came a long way. From where Waya chewed, slowly swallowed, and answered in an even tone. From the river west of here. Weeks on foot. Soldiers broke up our band. I kept moving east. There was no drama in her words, only the hard truth of hunger and flight. After a breath, she added, I stayed clear of ranchers, and their dogs hid whenever I had to. I didn't think I'd reach another settlement alive. Clay felt the weight of every word. He remembered the year her people were driven off, his own father cursing both soldiers and settlers for starting the war, and the girl who vanished with the smoke of burned camps. Guilt twisted inside him. He had gone on with his life while hers had been shattered. When Waya had eaten half her meal, she slid the plate aside with quiet care, not wishing to appear greedy. From a small pouch, she drew a roll of sinew thread, a bone needle, and a scrap of cloth, her only medicine. Meeting his eyes, she said simply, I need to close the wound myself, and touched the blood-stiff fabric at her ribs. Clay didn't speak at first. Part of him wanted to step away from the sight of torn flesh, but another part refused to turn his back. He brought the lamp closer, ready to help if her strength failed. Waya bit down hard as the needle pierced skin. The first stitch slipped, and her hand trembled. Clay leaned nearer, holding the lamp, so its glow caught the sweat on her brow. Steady now, he murmured, with neither pity nor judgment. She steadied and finished the work, tying each knot with care. Though pale, her hand no longer shook. She tore a strip from her hem and bound it tight. Clay poured hot water into a cup dropped in a pinch of willow bark and set it before her. She lifted the cup, gave him a faint nod, a silent thank you. The hush that followed was heavy, but not cold. It was the quiet of 2 people bound by memories, yet unsure if they shared a future. Waya wondered if he would let her stay beyond the night. Clay wondered too, already picturing the gossip at Silas Kane's store and Marshal Hank Rourke's watchful eyes. Neither spoke the choice aloud. Clay finally sat across from her elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards as if the answer might rise from the wood. She had survived weeks alone, but could not last much longer without help. He had spent years holding others at arm's length. This time he did not want to. Outside, the corral gate creaked in the wind. Inside, the stove popped softly. Both held their doubts, but stayed seated. For now, that was enough. At first light, a pale sky carried a bite of cold. Clay stepped out early, hammer tucked in his belt, and walked the fence while his coffee cooled on the porch rail. Sleep had been thin every time he closed his eyes. He saw Waya bent over the lamplight, stitching her own wound with quiet resolve. Inside, she was already awake. She had swept the floor with a makeshift broom, careful not to strain her ribs, and put yesterday's beans to simmer with a pinch of herbs from her pouch. Years on the run had taught her that people measured a stranger not just by words, but by usefulness. Still, unease stayed sharp. She knew the kindness she'd found here could vanish if the town pressed Clay too hard. So she forced herself to move as if she belonged, even if only for a single day. By mid-morning came the first ripple. A boy no more than 12, one of Silas Kane's, ambled past with a feed sack over his shoulder. He stopped staring wide-eyed at the woman on Clay's porch, then turned and ran back toward town. Waya's stomach tightened. She had seen how quickly a single curious glance could turn into a storm of whispers. When Clay returned to the yard and caught her uneasy look, he understood without words. "It's begun," he said flatly. She gave a brief nod. By noon, 2 men leaned on the rail outside the saloon, smoking and pointing toward the Maddox place. They didn't ride closer, but their stillness carried its own message. An hour later, Marshal Hank Rourke came at an easy walk, his horse puffing dust. A veteran of war and a man of measured ways, he ruled the settlement with patience more than force. But the badge on his chest meant he didn't ride by chance. "Morning, Clay," the marshal said evenly, his eyes resting on the woman seated on the stoop. Waya rose straight and unflinching, though her side still throbbed. She met his gaze head-on. Clay stepped to the fence, one hand resting on the top board. "Marshal, I hear you've been told I've got company," he said, voice steady as oak. Marshal Hank Rourke rested the reins loose in his hand. "That right?" he said evenly. Then he studied Waya Sky Feather a long moment, his face giving nothing away. Turning back to Clay Maddox, the marshal spoke in a low drawl. "You know how folks around here will see this? Doesn't matter if she's hurt or not. Talk will spread and talk brings trouble." Clay's voice stayed firm. "She's broken no law." "Didn't claim she had," Rourke replied, the saddle leather creaking as he shifted. "But I'm bound to keep order. If men decide to handle it themselves, that order gets harder to hold." Waya listened without so much as a flinch. Suspicion was no stranger to her. Still, her words came calm and clear. "I came because there was nowhere else left to walk. I asked for food, not a fight. If that is too much, I'll leave." Clay's jaw tightened. The thought of letting her walk back into the barren flats burned against every choice he'd made to stay silent in the past. He gave a sharp shake of his head. "You're not leaving." The marshal's eyes moved between them, measuring the weight of their words. Deep lines furrowed his weathered face before he finally nodded. "I'll tell folks you're under my watch. That'll buy you some time. But don't fool yourself, eyes will stay on you." He tipped his hat and rode off without another word. When the dust of his horse settled, Clay exhaled slowly. Waya hadn't moved from the stoop. For the first time since she'd arrived, her shoulders sagged just a little. In a whisper meant only for herself, she said, "It starts the same everywhere." Clay heard and felt the choice press heavier inside him. He knew the questions neighbors would ask. Why risk your own land for her? Why stir up old scars? Yet he already knew the answer. This time he would not look away. That night he gave her the bed and took the chair, listening to the soft creak of the house and the distant murmur of the town. When pain woke her near midnight, he rose silently and warmed a rag for her ribs. She accepted it with a brief glance that carried something unspoken trust, fragile but real. By dawn, though no words had been spoken, the choice was set. She stayed. He kept the door open. Whatever came from town, they would face together. The marshal's warning still lingered in Clay's mind as the next day broke. Rising before sunup as habit demanded, he found Waya already awake. The blanket was folded neat. The floor swept again, a small pot of beans with sage simmered on the stove. She moved with care, hiding the pain in her side whenever she thought he wasn't looking. She never complained, though he could read the strain in every careful step. Over his coffee, Clay weighed what lay ahead. He knew the gossip would only grow. If folks thought she was idle or a burden, the talk would cut sharper. People out here judged worth by hard work. He cleared his throat voice, quiet but steady. Fence on the north side's loose. Could use a hand with the wire. It was an offer, not an order. Reading the meaning beneath his words, Waya tightened the wrap around her ribs and nodded once. Show me. They walked into the yard where boards leaned from the last cattle push, and the wind had undercut the ground. Clay carried a shovel and spool of wire. She took the hammer. He dug while she held the post straight, her face taut with strain but refusing to yield. When the wire slipped, she adjusted without waiting for correction. He watched from the corner of his eye. Her hands were quick and sure. She might never have mended a corral, but she knew the rhythm of labor. By noon they had reset 2 posts and braced a corner tight. Sweat streaked their skin dust, rising with each move, and they spoke only when needed. Hold it steady. Drive the nail. Pull tighter. The silence was full of shared purpose. During a short pause, Clay asked what had kept her alive through those long weeks. Waya answered plainly, "Prickly pears creak. Water roots when I could find them. I stayed low and off the trails. If soldiers had seen me, I wouldn't be here. No drama, only truth." Clay felt a heaviness in his chest, picturing her alone, wounded, carrying on without help. He realized her decision to come here was not just desperation, it was memory. She remembered the boy who once shared bread and trusted he might not turn her away. That afternoon, Waya insisted on cooking. From cornmeal beans and a strip of salt pork, she made a meal, stretching each bit with herbs from her pouch. Steam curled through the small house as she stirred. Clay sat at the table watching. He thought of how long it had been since another person had filled this space with the sounds of steady work. He had built the cabin to keep others out, but with Waya moving about, it no longer felt empty. When supper was ready, Waya Sky Feather quietly set a bowl in front of Clay Maddox first. The simple gesture carried weight, respect, gratitude, and Clay answered it with a steady nod that meant acknowledgement more than manners. They ate unhurried, and for the first time since she'd come, the quiet between them felt easier. Later, as Clay saddled up for a supply run, Waya asked softly, "Do you want me to stay inside?" Her voice revealed the fear beneath being seen might stir sharper gossip. Clay thought a moment. Hiding her would only feed suspicion. "Stay in the yard," he said evenly. "Keep busy if you can. Folks notice work more than shadows." A faint smile touched her lips, ghost of the girl he remembered. "Then I'll work." At Silas Kane's store, Clay bought flour salt and a bolt of coarse cotton. Silas's eyes narrowed, but Clay met his look without a flicker. "She'll need the cloth," he said, laying down cash. It was the first time he'd spoken of Waya as if she belonged. When he returned, Waya had swept the porch, gathered kindling, and washed every plate until her hands were raw. She stood straight as he handed her the cloth, accepting it with quiet dignity. That night by the stove, Clay broke the silence. "Back quarter's good soil if we work it right. Needs a strong windbreak. We could plant corn come spring." He wasn't sure why he said it, maybe to test the sound of a future spoken aloud. Waya met his eyes and replied, without hesitation, "Windbreak needs brush set low. I can show you. We did that south of the river. The moment hung between them, more than survival, yet not quite a promise. When the lamps were lowered, Clay took the chair again and left her the bed. She lay awake a while, listening to his steady breathing, her ribs aching less than before. For the first time in weeks, she closed her eyes without fear. Clay, staring into the dark, felt his house, once only a refuge for solitude, shift into something meant for two. Morning came with an eerie stillness. The sky was pale, and a thin brown haze stretched across the flats, sign of trouble. Clay had seen it before, wind piling dust high enough to choke cattle and blind a man. He tightened the windmill's bolts and braced the blades. Waya watched from the stoop. Braid pulled tight the cotton wrap he'd brought her hidden beneath her dress. She read the meaning in his measured movements. "What's coming?" she asked. "A dust storm," he said bluntly. "Strong enough to choke stock and fill a house. We'll need water handy and every latch tight. You sure you're fit to help?" "If I can't work in a storm, I shouldn't be here," she answered, calm and sure. Together, they moved fast. Clay hauled heavy buckets to the troughs, while Waya tied cloths across the tops to keep grit out. Each time she bent, pain caught her, but she forced through it. When the windmill groaned with the first hard gust, Clay glanced at the sky, then back at her. "Inside, soon. But first we brace the west boards, help me hold them." They nailed 2 loose planks over every gap where dust could drive in. Each hammer blow jarred her ribs, but she stayed firm. Sweat streaked her temple. Clay noticed and was ready to take over, but she shook her head. She wasn't proving herself to him now, she was proving to herself that she could still endure. By noon, the gale hit full force, sharp with grit. The horizon vanished in brown fury. Dust forced its way under door frames and sifted through every seam. Inside, Clay stuffed cloth in cracks, while Waya soaked rags and pressed them against the sills. Their world shrank to the space of a single room, the roar outside. Louder than any shout, they shared the last of the morning's stew at the table, each spoonful laced with grit despite their efforts. Waya coughed once, pressing a damp rag to her mouth. "How long will it last?" she asked. "Could be hours, could be days," Clay replied, eyes flicking to the door each time it rattled. She studied him, the set of his shoulders, the calm he held while the storm raged. She thought of the boy she once knew by the creek, quick to laugh and restless, and saw how different this man had become. Worn by years, slower to speak, yet there was strength in that stillness. Clay in turn kept glancing at her. Thin, weary, wounded, yet she sat upright and unafraid. He thought of the risk she'd taken to come here, of how she'd stitched her own wound without complaint, of how she now faced the storm, as though she had always belonged under this roof. Respect stirred in him, deepening into trust. Night brought no mercy. Dust seeped into blankets, coated the floor, and settled in their hair. Clay rose often to check the stove and door, while Waya kept the rags wet and tight. They spoke little, but when their eyes met in the lamplight, both knew what the other held back. Fear, yes, but also the decision to endure, side by side. At dawn, the wind fell silent. The land lay hushed and colorless under a weak sun. Fence posts leaned under drifts of grit, the yard half buried. Clay opened the door, blinking in the bright calm, and stepped outside. Waya followed shawl drawn close. Together they surveyed the wreckage. It was bad, but not ruin. The cattle stood, the troughs still held water, and the windmill still turned. Waya Sky Feather drew a long breath, the first in hours not choked with grit. She looked to Clay Maddox and said quietly, "It might have taken us." Clay met her eyes, a flicker of relief softening his rugged face. But it didn't. They spent that day digging out the fence line, clearing the yard, setting things right. The storm had tested them both, and neither had bent. By sundown, the prairie still looked raw, but something between them had deepened out here. Standing a storm side by side meant more than words. The hush that followed felt heavier than the wind itself. For 2 days they worked shoulder to shoulder, clearing grit that had piled against the fences and slipped under the door. Their hands blistered clothes stiff with dust, but the rhythm of labor steadied them. By the third dawn, the land lay scarred yet livable, and Clay dared think the worst was past. He was wrong. Late that morning, 2 riders came down the north road, their horses slow but sure, the kind bred for long miles. Dust-stained dusters hung from their shoulders, hats pulled low, eyes sharp. They weren't drifters or neighbors. They were the sort paid to track and collect. Clay knew their kind. He set aside the shovel and leaned on the fence, his rifle within reach, though still at rest. The riders halted at the gate. The taller one called out, his voice carrying clear across the yard. "We're looking for an Apache woman. Came through after a skirmish by the river. Heard she might have reached this far." Clay kept his face unreadable. "Plenty of travelers pass by. I don't keep count." The second man let his gaze slide past him toward the house. Waya stood in the doorway, shawl drawn close, face steady though pale. She didn't step back or hide, but the tight set of her jaw told she knew exactly who they were. The tall rider tipped his chin toward her. That one. Before Clay could speak, another voice cut through the tension. Marshal Hank Rourke rode in slow from the ridge, his horse snorting dust. He'd clearly trailed them from a distance. Pulling up beside the gate, one hand easy on the reins, he said, "Morning, gentlemen. You here on county business?" The tall rider shifted, annoyed. "Private matter. Bounty posters out of Prescott. Apache girl fits her look. We'll take her and be gone." Rourke's tone stayed calm, but edged with steel. "Not without papers signed in this county? I've seen no warrant, no legal claim. If you've got something official, ride with me to my office, and we'll check the books." The second rider scowled. "Since when does a marshal shield savages?" Rourke's eyes narrowed, though his voice stayed level. "Since my job is law, not letting men drag folks off a porch on rumor." "You got a name," Waya spoke. Her hands clenched, but her voice steady. "Waya Sky Feather, daughter of Taza. My people were scattered weeks ago. I have broken no law here." She stated it plain, not as plea, but fact. The tall rider spat into the dust. "No law maybe, but plenty of reason." He turned to Clay, measuring him. "You hiding her cowboy, that your game." For an instant, the weight of choice pressed hard. Clay could have stepped aside, let them haul her away, ending risk and rumor alike. But he remembered how she stitched her own wound by lamplight, how she stood firm through the storm, how she'd met his eyes that first night, and asked if he remembered. He knew his answer before he spoke. "She's under my roof," Clay said, voice firm as iron. "That makes her my concern." The riders shifted hands close to their belts. Rourke nudged his horse forward, revolver hanging easy but ready. "You heard the man. No papers, no warrant. You want to push it, you test me first." Only the creak of the windmill broke the stillness. Then the tall rider muttered a curse, jerked his reins, and wheeled his horse. The second followed their silhouettes, shrinking across the flats. Rourke watched until they were specks, then turned back. "You just made yourself part of this Maddox." They'll be back, or others will. You still sure Clay met the marshal's gaze without a flicker? I'm sure. The marshal gave a brief nod, settled his hat, and rode toward town. When the dust of his horse drifted off, Clay turned to see Waya still in the doorway, calm on the surface. Her eyes held a depth he couldn't miss, a blend of fear and gratitude too strong for words. For the first time, she stepped fully onto the stoop, closing the space between them. You didn't have to, she said softly. Yes, Clay replied, voice quiet, but absolute. I did. In that simple exchange, a line was crossed. From that day on, her place in his home was no longer temporary. He had made it plain he would stand against whoever came. For several days after the bounty hunters left the settlement, stayed still. Clay and Waya kept to their work, mending storm damage, hauling water, tending the patch of earth he hoped to plant come spring. The marshal didn't return, and neither did the hired riders. Both Clay Maddox and Waya Sky Feather sensed the uneasy quiet around them. It wasn't trust yet, only a pause. Folks were waiting, measuring how long he would keep her under his roof. On the fourth morning, a sharp cry ripped across the settlement, high and frantic, the sound of a mother's terror. Clay was tightening a gate hinge when it reached him. He dropped the hammer and looked up. Waya, carrying a pail of water nearby, had already stiffened. She knew that cry too well. Without a word, she set the bucket down and strode fast toward town. Clay swore under his breath and followed. By the time they reached the well behind Pastor Eli Boone's church, a crowd had formed, boots scuffing up dust, as worried voices tangled in the air. A boy, 6, maybe 7, had fallen through a rotten cover and into the shaft. His mother, Nora Pike, knelt at the edge, clawing at stones, her sobs slicing through the commotion. The pastor called for planks, but none arrived. The rope at hand was too short. Waya didn't hesitate. She pushed through the ring of frontier settlers, her voice ringing clear. Bring me a strong rope now. Men exchanged uneasy glances, startled by an Apache woman taking command. Clay broke through the circle right behind her, his tone hard as iron. Do as she says. A coil of rope was dragged forward. Clay looped it around Waya's waist, his hands firm and sure. You certain? He asked in a low voice meant for her alone. I've hauled water from pits deeper than this, she answered. I can do it. Without waiting for approval, Waya slid into the dark shaft, the rope squealing against the stones as Clay braced himself above boots, dug in muscles tight. The damp walls scraped her shoulders as she lowered herself. She found Cody Pike clinging to a narrow ledge, small arms trembling but alive. Hold on to me, she whispered, steady and calm. Don't let go. Above, Clay shouted, Pull! The crowd surged to help, straining at the rope. Waya's ribs screamed, but she clutched Cody and held tight. Inch by inch they rose until the boy's head cleared the stones. Pastor Boone reached down and lifted him free. Nora Pike collapsing around her child with sobs of pure relief. The square fell silent, everyone staring as Clay hauled Waya up the rest of the way. She dragged herself onto solid ground, coughing from the damp air, palms raw from the rope. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then the quiet broke, not with scorn, but with a low murmur of something closer to respect. Lila Kane stepped forward, laid a hand on Waya's shoulder, and said softly, You saved him. Others shifted, their hardened views dented by what they'd seen. Moments later, Marshal Hank Rourke rode in his horse lathered from the run. He took in the scene, Cody safe in his mother's arms, Waya pale and exhausted, Clay standing guard, and tipped his hat. For the first time, his look held no warning, only acknowledgement. That evening, Waya sat on the stoop, ribs bound again, body aching, but spirit steady. Clay handed her a cup of water and sat beside her. They listened to the windmill creak and the faint hum of town life drifting over the flats. "Everywhere I go, eyes follow me," she said at last. Today they watched different. Clay nodded toward the darkening horizon. "You showed them who you are. That's something they won't forget easy." "You pulled me out too," she added quietly. "Without you, I'd still be in the dark." Clay shook his head. "Without you, that boy might still be." The silence that followed carried no weight of doubt, only the quiet that settles after something has been proven. For the first time since she arrived, Waya felt the ground beneath her feet belonged to her as much as to him. The next day, the settlement's air felt changed. Not warm, not welcoming, but the sharp edge of suspicion had dulled. At Silas Kane's store, when Clay stopped for flour and nails, Lila Kane quietly set a small sack of coffee on the counter. "For thanks," she said. Silas only cleared his throat and wrote the purchase without a word. Waya sensed the shift, too. Later that week, she walked beside Clay into town to help carry supplies. No one spat at her feet or turned away outright. There were still long stares, but some held curiosity rather than hate. A woman at the well even gave a brief nod. It wasn't acceptance, but it was hard-won breathing room. Waya knew such moments could turn with a single rumor, yet she took it as something earned. Back at the homestead, Clay spoke more about the land's future. He had once thought of the place only as a hideaway, but with Waya there, the quiet no longer felt like emptiness. Pointing toward the darker soil near the ridge, he began to imagine what they might plant together come spring. "If we plant a windbreak here, it'll trap enough moisture for a good run of corn. Maybe beans, too," Clay Maddox said, brushing loose dirt from his hands. Waya Sky Feather studied the ground and nodded. "Stack brush low so the sand can't creep under. South of the river, we used mesquite and yucca." She crouched and traced a clean line in the dust, marking where the rows might stretch. Clay knelt beside her, listening with an attentiveness he hadn't given anyone in years. That night, Marshal Hank Rourke rode in carrying a sealed packet from the county seat. He sat easy in the saddle by the fence and handed it down. "Homestead claim," he said. "Back quarters still open. File it in both names and she'll have standing. No drifter or bounty man can say she doesn't belong here if you're gone." Clay read the papers by lantern glow, while Waya stood silently beside him. The marshal waited without another word, then tipped his hat and rode back toward town. Clay folded the claim carefully and laid it on the table. "Saturday we ride in," he said. "We'll file it together." Waya searched his face. "You'd put my name on your land. It's our land if you choose it," he answered simply. No flourish, just the solid truth. The days before Saturday carried a different rhythm, less like mending and more like shaping a life. They straightened the storm-bent corral posts. Waya gathered wild herbs and taught Clay how to dry them for medicine. She patched his work shirt with the coarse cotton he'd bought her, each stitch firm and clean. When he put it on, he felt her care in every thread. Clay began leaving his rifle on its wall pegs instead of carrying it everywhere. He realized he trusted the place again, and trusted her. Waya, testing her ribs and her strength, began walking the fence line alone, claiming the ground step by step. One evening, they sat by the corral cattle, shifting in the cool dusk. Clay broke the quiet. "When we were kids, you gave me a strip of smoked deer meat. First time I ever tasted anything like that. My father didn't approve, but I didn't care." A faint smile touched Waya's lips, the first true one since she'd come. I remember you traded me your bread. Softest bread I ever had. They let the memories settle, weaving old friendship into the work of new days. Saturday morning they rode to the county seat. Clay signed the papers with a steady hand. Waya wrote her name beside his each careful stroke, carrying the weight of a life she'd fought to keep. The clerk stamped and returned the deed. Marshal Rourke signed as witness. It was done. On the ride home, Waya kept the folded paper in her pouch, touching it now and then, not to check it, but to feel its reality. For the first time since fleeing the river, she believed the land beneath her might truly hold her. That evening they ate cornbread and beans by lamplight, the air between them settled and sure. Neither spoke of promises. The deed itself said enough. She was no longer a guest. She belonged. Still, a paper claim didn't silence every hard stare. By week's end, trouble came slow from the north road. Near sundown, 3 men appeared at the fence. Clay knew them by sight, regulars at the saloon men who drank more than they worked and liked to stir trouble. Tonight they brought more than talk. One swung a half-empty bottle, another let his hand rest too near his revolver, and the third spat in the dirt with every step of his horse, as though marking territory. Waya stood in the yard with a basket of kindling. The instant she saw them, she knew what they were: men hunting a fight at someone else's cost. She set the basket down, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the porch where Clay had just stepped out. He carried no rifle, only the worn revolver at his hip, but the way he stood was enough. The leader, a broad man with a scar carved across his cheek, spoke first. "Evening, Maddox. Looks like you've set yourself up with a new kind of arrangement out here." The scar-faced rider's voice was sharp with mockery, loud enough for every man with him to hear. "Paper or no paper?" He went on, "Folks don't take kindly to an Apache woman calling herself a homesteader." Clay Maddox leaned against the porch post, arms loose at his sides, voice flat. "You've had your say. Now ride on." The second rider barked a harsh laugh that cut through the dry air. "We're not here for talk. We're here to remind you the town doesn't want her. Turn her out and we're done. Keep her and you're picking a side you can't hold." His hand slid slow toward his revolver, letting the threat settle heavy. Waya Sky Feather stepped closer to the porch, one hand steady on the gate latch. Her ribs still ached on bad days, but she didn't waver. If they rushed the yard, she'd hold the gate until Clay fired. Her thoughts raced, not from fear of dying, but from fear of being dragged back to a life of running when she'd just found ground to stand on. The standoff might have turned bloody if not for a calm voice from the elm beyond the fence. "That's far enough." Marshal Hank Rourke rode out of the dusk, revolver drawn, barrel low but sure. He'd been watching since sundown, trusting his hunch that men like these wouldn't let quiet last. The scarred leader wheeled halfway around, sneering. "Marshal, this isn't your fight." Rourke's jaw tightened. "It's the county's fight if you draw on a man at his own fence. You want to press it, I'll drop the first one who does." His tone left no doubt. The 3 hesitated. The scarred man spat again, but with less conviction. "This isn't over, Maddox. You'll wish you'd thought harder." With that, he jerked his reins. The 3 horses turned and trotted back into the fading light, their curses thinning into the dusk. The yard fell quiet. Clay lowered his hand from the revolver, but kept his eyes on the road long after the riders disappeared. The marshal holstered his weapon and looked squarely at him. "You've made your choice plain. Don't expect the road to get easier." Clay gave a short nod. "Never asked for easy?" Rourke tipped his hat toward Waya. "You held steady." Then he turned his horse and disappeared toward town, leaving the yard to the hush of cooling air. Inside, when the lamps were lit, Clay sat at the table cleaning the revolver in silence. Waya laid her hand over his for the first time since arriving. Not for comfort or thanks, but as a mark of standing with him in the choice he had just confirmed before the whole county. Clay looked at her hand, calloused, but sure then at her face. No words passed, but the meaning was clear. They were no longer just surviving side by side. They were bound now in name in land and in defiance of anyone who tried to break them apart. That night, Clay left the rifle on the hooks by the door again. This time it wasn't just trust in the quiet. It was the certainty that if trouble returned, they would face it together. The house stayed hushed after the confrontation, but neither slept deeply. Both listened for hoofbeats, for shouts, for men bold enough to finish what they'd begun. None came. When dawn broke, the corral stood intact, and the wide land lay empty except for the low calls of cattle. The threat had passed for now, yet both knew the real test would be whether the settlement would keep pressing or finally let them be. In the days that followed, something shifted in town. The riders never returned. Word spread that Marshal Rourke himself had backed Clay at his own fence revolver in hand. Folks weighed that against the well rescue, and the deed filed in both their names. Fewer wanted to stir talk they couldn't back with action. Suspicion still lingered, but open challenge eased. Conversations drifted back to weather cattle prices and incoming freight. Clay felt the change when he stopped at Silas Kane's store. Silas no longer narrowed his eyes, simply weighed out flour, and kept his silence. Lila Kane even asked if Waya needed more of the herbs she'd brought earlier. Clay didn't mistake it for warm welcome, but it was enough no sharper stares than usual, no whispers cut short when he entered. Life at the homestead began to settle into a rhythm that felt less like borrowed time. Waya planted along the windbreak, stacking brush low, just as she'd described. Clay turned the back quarter with the plow, the rough soil folding dark under his hands. Together they hauled water-patched posts and shared simple meals. It wasn't abundance, but it was theirs. One quiet Sunday afternoon, Pastor Eli Boone rode in with a Bible tucked beneath his coat and a single folded sheet inside. After speaking with Marshal Rourke and the county clerk, he asked one plain question. Would you like the claim filed as marriage as well as homestead? Clay turned to Waya, the question hanging in the warm stillness. She met Clay Maddox's eyes without a flicker of fear or doubt. One clear word left her lips. Yes. Pastor Eli Boone stood with them in the open yard, the windmill creaking overhead and the corral stretching wide behind. Marshal Hank Rourke and Lila Kane served as witnesses, their expressions solemn but respectful. The pastor spoke the vows plain and brief. Clay and Waya Sky Feather signed their names on the page. No rings, no music, no long speeches, just the county seal, and 2 signatures sealing what their hearts had already chosen. Afterward, they shared a simple meal of cornbread beans and the coffee Lila Kane had quietly sent along. When the witnesses rode back toward town, Clay and Waya sat on the stoop, letting the evening settle over their land. For the first time, neither felt the strain of waiting for a knock at the door or a demand at the gate. As the weeks turned toward summer, the earth answered their labor. Corn lifted green along the ridge beans climbed the poles Waya had set, and the low brush of the windbreak held the soil. The cattle filled out the troughs, stayed clean, and the house began to look like a home for 2. Clay noticed how her shawl now hung beside his hat on the peg, how 2 pairs of boots rested by the door. The emptiness that once defined the cabin was gone. One evening, As they leaned on the corral fence, watching the herd settle in the dusk, Clay said quietly, "The day you came, I almost didn't open that gate." Waya turned to him, her face calm, her eyes gentler than when she had first arrived. "And yet you did." He gave a short nod. "I won't close it again." She placed her hand in his, not as thanks or reassurance, but as a simple act of belonging. The silence that followed carried no fear, no uncertainty, only the weight of a life freely chosen and shared. The town never grew warm, but it became fair enough. No more hired riders came prowling, no more whispers carried a threat. The well behind Pastor Boone's church stood capped and chained, and Marshal Rourke kept a quiet, steady watch. Life moved forward in the rhythm of steady work and unspoken trust. Clay and Waya's bond rested not on grand promises, but on daily proofs the water left ready on the stoop, the rope tied sure at the well, the deed that bore both their names. What had begun as bare survival had grown into permanence, and the land once silent and wind-scoured had become their home. By the close of that summer, with corn high along the windbreak and cattle lowing in the dusk, their story needed no more questions. They had faced storms, outlaws, the town, and each other. They had chosen to stay. And in the Wild West, that was love enough. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.